Like everything's working, including the closed captioning. So, if you remember, we were here before, we were in Heidegger's Dam, and just let me give a little bit of a recap because that'll help us with what we're doing today. Um, the reason we did all this stuff with Heraclitus and Andy Goldsworthy and all is you can see the sun's energy kind of like a stream, right? It streams down. Sometimes it's just the right amount. You have a properly designed house, so it'll heat it right. But if it's absent for a week or more, that presents a problem. And other times, solar houses that use passive solar heating have a problem with this. It overheats because of it. So you think about it, this presents a problem. And if you're familiar with like what's happening with renewable energy, of course, this is a major problem because how do you store the energy that we have? And of course, battery technology is one idea. Fossilized solar energy in the form of fossil fuels resolve this problem. This is why we have a fossil fuel economy, arguably why fossil fuels were so incredibly powerful and came on the scene, because we had technology. We had things like windmills for centuries that provided a lot of power. It actually, the early industrial revolution, before the steam engine came online, it was powered by wind and hydroelectric powers. But the problem is, again, that's not the kind of thing you have all the time. So we very much like this idea of having it stockpiled and held in reserve. In that sense, if you follow Heidegger's argument here, our love of fossil fuels is kind of metaphysical, in that it's a frustration with phusis. It's a frustration with the stream that is inconsistent. Sometimes streams too much, sometimes streams a little. Fossil fuels, you don't have that problem if you have enough reserves of them, which we've had. I hear people talking. I guess people are getting settled in. Okay. So, Heidegger took this further, by the way, and argued that once we got this love of constancy, of things being always there, a constant presence, we got a little too close and we got sucked in with human beings. Now, human beings are, in this way of thinking, standing in reserve, human resources, what Heidegger calls Der Bestand, which means, constant source, waiting to be used. So in other words, our culture is set up this way. There's one thing to have a factory that is being powered by fossil fuels. And again, that's really what made the Industrial Revolution happen. But then you needed human beings there too, and they are standing in their place waiting to be used as well. And to many people, this led to like a dehumanizing of humanity because it made us just stuff to be used. And arguably, that's still the case in a whole range of jobs, even office workers, people in their cubicles waiting to be used at any time. Human resources, which is kind of an odd thing to think of, just the phrase human resources. Hannah Arendt, Heidegger's student, arguably the more interesting and more thoughtful of the two, agreed in many respects, but she said, yeah, you've got the right idea, but this has been going on for thousands of years. This is what's made human beings human. But what she was thinking about principally is the West. And let me just explain that a little further. Even as early as the myth of Gilgamesh, we see important mentions. You might have slipped over them, and there's more in what we didn't read of, like bread and grain. This was a major technological innovation, and it's another way of understanding standing reserve, because before agriculture, human beings had to rely on the flow of food. Sometimes when things in season, you would have them. It's kind of like an abundant stream and it's really streaming. Other times you don't have it. If you live in a really cold climate where it's winter, it's a real problem. And the big solution, and it's an amazing solution, was in Gilgamesh's part of the world, what we call the Middle East now, happened to other parts of the planet, but this really kicked off Western culture, is not only that we did agriculture, that's one thing, but we specifically started raising food, certain variety of food for their seeds. what we called grain. And that grain, even in Egypt, even slightly before Gilgamesh's time, they had massive storage of that, like 2 or 3 years worth of it. And what is that? Well, in Heidegger's and Arendt's way of thinking, that's standing reserve. That made it so that you didn't have to worry about your civilization, supplying food for you and all. I mean, you don't have to worry about nature supplying food, because if there's a drought or there's a whatever, you had enough food to do that. We still do it today, by the way. You may not know, but the United States stores massive amounts of grain just in case there's a problem. Arendt makes a kind of a cringeworthy comment when she says, any culture worthy of the name of being human does this, and she sees cultures that don't as not being quite human. And again, that's enormously problematic. It's not just cringeworthy; it's deplorable. But anyhow, that's her take on it. So that's where we are with this metaphysical thinking. What I want to do in number 5 is pull all this together, what we've been talking about already. So this question of what is nature, and this is going to be eco-criticism, eco-theology, and eco-philosophy. It's everything we've been doing really since number 2. So it's sort of a summation of lectures 2, 3, and 4. And as you remember, as early as Gilgamesh, we had dualism, and this becomes an issue. With this additional understanding of metaphysical physical dualism, and we got that, remember, the idea of dualism in Judeo-Christian thinking and also Greco-Roman thinking, but with this notion that Heidegger and then Arendt come forth, we can return to this survey of dualism in the West. So that's what this is going to be. What we're doing today, the overarching idea, is that this kind of dualism has existed and been a cornerstone in the West for over 5,000 years. We see it full-blown, or becoming full-blown, in Gilgamesh. We certainly see it by the time we get to the Hebrew Testament. We certainly see it with the so-called Golden Age of Greece and people like Plato and Aristotle. And it works on a variety of different registers: place, deity, time, and so forth. In most of these manifestations, and this is why it's kind of problematic, the metaphysical is privileged at the cost of the physical. In other words, the physical is inferior to the metaphysical. And as I go through these one by one, you'll see how that happens. It's especially troubling, though, from an environmental point of view, when we realize this preference is being enacted on a massive scale in technological modernity. So, in other words, what Heidegger said, we have this preference for constant presence. Yes, it creates a reservoir out of a stream. That's a good example of it. But in a bigger sense, that's what the fossil fuel economy is about. It's this, constant presence there all the time. And we have to have that, right? We have to be able to hit that switch and get electricity anytime, or to get heat anytime. And we haven't adapted ourselves to nature in the sense of nature's constantly changing, but we've adapted nature to us. So you kind of see that in Santa Barbara. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of need for heat and air conditioning in Santa Barbara, and yet so many houses have it. What do I mean by that? Well, I can tell you that even on a cold day, your house in Santa Barbara is probably not going to get below like 60 or 55 degrees. And even on a very hot day, it doesn't get that hot here. Inside of your house is probably not going to get maybe 80 or 85 degrees. So you really don't need heating and air conditioning if you are willing to say, I am happy to live in a house between 60 and 80 degrees. It's going to be a little cold sometimes, I'll need a sweater. Other times it's going to be a little hot. But according to Heidegger, and the argument stands that, well, we want it to be 68 to 72 degrees all the time. That's the only thing that we're going to accept. So we put this massive infrastructure in. So we have air conditioning so that it is constantly that temperature, like a constant 70 degrees. That's making nature or natural resources, conform to us rather than us conform to them. We'll see other examples of this. Physical and metaphysical. First, our first iClicker poll for today. Let me start it. I have to select this. Yes, I'm curious what you think of the readings that we've had so far. And even if you're behind with the readings, you can still hit E if you're really behind with the readings and you don't feel you have a good enough feel for them. But if you're really behind with the readings, you should get caught up with the readings now. Next week we'll talk about the midterm, but the midterm will be 2 weeks from this Thursday, so it's not that far away. So let's just see. And by the way, I'm gonna little disclaimer. I mean, the readings are important readings. I didn't select them because they're the most fun, but they're kind of like essential. You would have, he should, if we're going to understand the golden age. And the answer is some are interesting, some are not so. Yeah, I actually think I might have given that answer too. They've, are they all interesting? So most of them are pretty good, but I think that's accurate. But again, they're not selected to be. Unfortunately, if I were just doing like a novel course and I wanted you to have really interesting readings, we would have approached it differently. But here, unfortunately, you may not like reading the account of Genesis, but it's just essential. So remember, we have this understanding from the Greeks, like Heraclitus. Andy Goldsworthy exemplified it, how nature is constantly becoming, it's constantly change, it's emerging and passing away. But then Plato says, nope, true nature never changes. That's the metaphysical realm. That's the realm of being. And of course, that dovetails with Judeo-Christian thinking. We can pull together what we've been saying about the relationship between the physical and the metaphysical. And that's what we'll be doing today. One last slide. What follows is a recap of metaphysical dualism on a variety of registers. So it's set up a little differently than our typical mind map. It's a line going across here. And let me show you how this will work. That line going across roughly, that big gray line roughly across the middle of the screen, is separating the physical from the metaphysical. Up here, everything above this line is the metaphysical. So I'm using its original Greek word, metaphysis, beyond nature. And down here is physis. This is nature. So in a general way, what's up here? Well, the Judeo-Christian God, heaven, Platonic ideas, things that don't change. They're beyond the earth. They're in another realm. And the signature thing about them is they don't change. So if you believe in the notion of the Christian heaven, everything there is eternal. You get eternal life there. You're eternally young there. Everything is just great forever and ever and ever. What's down here? Well, this is nature in the sense of, the Greek Heraclitus, a sense of process, everything that changes. But Plato actually nailed it when he said, what's down here is what you understand through sense experience. In other words, what you smell, you feel, you see, you taste, you hear. This is everything that you can encounter that way. The only way you can encounter this up here is to imagine it intellectually. It has to be an intellectual act to imagine something without change. And people can. We can do that. I mean, you couldn't imagine God in this sense, or heaven, or the Platonic ideas, if you didn't have that imaginative capacity. But down here is everything that you've ever seen or at all. This is the only thing that you could corroborate through a sense experience. Plants, animals, the earth, everything physical. And not surprising, physical derives from the word physis, here. So what we'll do now, we're going to keep this line here across, separating the metaphysical from the physical, and we'll just slide over here and talk about deity. Move this down a little, in this case. So what's up here? Well, it depends on how you imagine your deity. If you imagine a metaphysical deity like Shamash, this sun god who wasn't part of the physical realm, who was somehow up there in the sky, or it gets imagined more completely the Judeo-Christian God, what we call him, and it is a him, Jehovah Adonai, whatever name that deity has. That deity is in a metaphysical realm. That deity is there in heaven and is not part of the physical realm. It's a question. People will say, well, was the physical realm created out of that God or not? Theologians will, debate this for many, many hundreds of years, still debating it today. Anyhow, another type of deity, which we've encountered, are earth gods, deities that are moored to the earth, that are part of the earth. We saw the first one, bigger than life in a way, which is Humbaba in the myth of Gilgamesh. But also I mentioned like the ancient trinity, the ancient goddesses that predate the patriarchal religions that we're talking about. Still kind of in place in Gilgamesh, but certainly for tens of thousands of years. And even in Greek thinking, you have like in the myth, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the myth of Demeter and Persephone, where it's a three-part female goddess. Persephone, also known as Kor, which is the Greek word for girl or prepubescent. Demeter is the woman of child-rearing age, and then Hecate is beyond child-rearing age. They are always of the earth. They're not imagined, this trinity is not imagined being somewhere up in the sky normally. The older religions just don't function that way. So jumping from deity, here, sliding over, to place. So what kind of places would you have up here? Well, the Judeo-Christian heaven, that's a place where you can reside. If you're one of the faithful, you believe that you'll, with any luck, you'll spend eternity living in that place. Plato's realm of ideas is imagined as a place. And in terms of when we get to well, we've already seen it, but especially when we get to pastoral thinking, the locus amenus, this locus amenus, this most amiable locale, pleasant place, they're the ultimate pleasant places. I mean, if it is in fact possible to live for eternity, hey, you want to live in heaven, it's the ultimate pleasant place. Even though it's metaphysical, they're kind of placeless places, and they exist nowhere in the physical realm. And by the time you get to the medieval and certainly the early modern period, theologians have given up any thought that it's somewhere you could actually go. So once people understand that there are other planets and all with Galileo and his era, then people aren't imagining that, if you could take a rocket somewhere out into space, you'd get to heaven. It's a placeless place. The earth is increasingly seen after this Judeo-Christian Bible and Plato's metaphysical realm as an imperfect place, right? If this is perfect here, the ultimate, amiable locale, this is an imperfect place. It's definitely not a locus amenus. There are just so many problems with it, and maybe even defined by sin, right? So what's the main characteristic here? Sin is released in this world. There is no sin. If you get into heaven, you don't have to worry, you don't have to try not to sin anymore because there's no sin there. But here there is, and this may even be kind of the playground of Satan in the sense that he is tempting people to sin down here. But it's whatever else, it's clearly not a perfect place. It's just really unpleasant in this view, and that should give you pause, right? I mean, if you're imagining the world, if you actually go out to a place like Yosemite and are overwhelmed with what a wondrous place that is and how perfect it is, but in this view, no, it's however perfect it may seem, it's not. That's going to change. We're going to see Christian and ultimately theist thinkers coming out of Christianity, like in the 19th century, and John Muir would be the touchstone there, who are going to see like Yosemite as a wonderfully magical place. But for, thousands of years, it was not the case. So time, can I move this over a little? Yeah, there you go. Up here is a changeless realm. There's no change up there. Time doesn't work up there. Things just are and always will be as they are. They're immortal, they're perfect, they're unchanged. So Judeo-Christian God in heaven, yeah, but this is where Plato comes in line. Plato's thinking of justice and beauty, it just doesn't change. The standard he has of justice is not going to change. So if you are a moral relativist, this is going to be a problem. What I mean by that is, well, maybe killing would be justified under some sort of context. That would be just to do that. Plato would say, no, there's no way that happens. Justice is what justice is. There is no reason that you could say something was just, whereas, in his view, it's always that way. And even more problematic to our modern sensibilities, at least I hope, is the notion of beauty, that you would have this one standard of beauty. And of course, this is a time, Plato was a time before cultural relativism. He felt that his culture had that particular standard of beauty. People outside of the culture didn't measure up to the standard of beauty. And unfortunately, this will continue, right, for hundreds, thousands of years into the 20th, I guess maybe even today, where people have a view that one culture exemplifies beauty, and that is, something that's never going to change. In terms of time, down here is the Greek word, Heraclitus, this word is gignoma. You don't have to know it, but that's the Greek word for becoming or emergence into being. Down here is birth, life, death, the endless bringing forth and passing away of phusis. We had this like with Andy Goldsworthy's art, or a blossoming rose, a streaming stream, life of animals, life of human beings. This is a realm of constant changing, of a realm of time. In a way, the Platonic realm, Judeo-Christian heaven, that's a realm of without time, really. Time doesn't work there. But here, time, it's all about time. Everything is caught up in the river of time. You could call Heraclitus's river the river of time if you wanted to think of it in these terms. Dualistic human beings are a little unusual because you have this line, metaphysical, physical. We are half up here and half down here. We're the only thing like this in this view. And this is both for Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman thinking. How does that work? Well, up here is the realm of the soul. You may hear later philosophers like Descartes, when we get to him, is going to call it mind, but it's something apart from the body. And what is it? It's the best part of a person, and arguably the true human being. Why would I say? Well, I'll tell you why I say that in a minute. But the body is going to pass away. Your body is here for whatever 100 years, but this thing, the soul or the mind, this metaphysical entity, lives on eternally. So metaphysical thinkers, they often privilege the soul. In other words, that's the true human being. And it's almost, if you believe in this view, it's almost like a de facto argument for it, because if you are your body and your body dies after 100 years, what lives on for eternity? Well, it's your soul, but mustn't that be your true self? I mean, did you leave your true self behind? Is your true self decaying in the ground? Well, no, your true self is the one that's going to live forever. So you can see why that part of who you are is going to be privileged, and the body is going to be seen as this transient thing, and maybe even a problematic thing. And we'll talk about that right here. So down here is the other half of human beings. This is the realm of the body. So mind-body dualism. Christian theologians would often call it the flesh. And it's often seen as inferior by both Christians and Platonists alike. And why? Because, it's inferior, but it's often believed to be a source of temptation. In other words, you, this holistic being, this ephemeral being, if that's who you are, if you're mainly this, this disembodied soul, then the flesh is the temptation for you. If you're here on earth, the thing you have to worry about is giving in to the flesh. And that is often seen as giving in to sin. What would that be like? Well, sexual temptation, things that you would do that are physical, that are of the flesh. And that's why, in this view, you should try to remember that you're this thing up here, you're this soul, and not give in to this. And yeah, I mean, this is kind of an oversimplification. It will vary with different, sects of Christianity and all, for sure. But it's often this view, and by the way, this is alive and well today. Even if you're like a a post-Christian thinker, like beyond it. It influences the world. I can't help but remember there was one of the original Star Wars movies, and Yoda is like dropping this big truth bomb, and he says, "We are not this body. We are luminous beings of light." Well, Yoda's not supposed to be Christian or influenced by Christian thinking, but it's clear to the people who made that film that that's still a very dualistic view. We are not this body, we are luminous beings of light. And, where did that come from? Why did the filmmaker or writer include that? I don't know for sure, but it is certainly something that has escaped into the broader culture, and in our culture it often comes directly from both this sort of Christian tradition and the Platonic one as well. Just to clarify, so you see where Plato stands here. Plato has his own little things jumping the line here, and reason is up here, and sensory and mere opinion is down here. So what's up here? This is the intelligible region. Things get known here through intellect alone. This is where you need intelligence. Reason, the Greek word is nous here. The intelligible realm is true reality. The nature we sense is illusory. And this realm, interestingly, is accessible to human beings, unlike the Christian heaven. So in other words, if you study enough and do what Socrates has done, after 35 years, and he says 35 years, you too may become, if you're the right kind of person, an exceptional person, you too might become a philosopher king and have access to this realm. It's interesting for a couple of reasons, however. Most human beings can't. So this is just for the special human beings, the most intellectual human beings. So already you have this sort of meritocracy. The most privileged people are the most intellectual, and most people are not that. And it goes without saying that most beings that are not human beings, your dog, your cat, and every other creature on the planet, they have no access to this. They don't have reason. This, to Socrates and Plato, is what makes us different. And when they say different, they mean better. And it makes some people better than others. And this will continue throughout, like, the history of the West in the area of colonialism, where you have a group of people saying, yeah, well, defines us. We encounter these other people. They don't have it the same way. This is why we're special. It's nasty and worrisome, I hope you can see. What's down here? The sensory realm of earth and physis, like Plato's cave, is an illusory appearance. It's a deception. It's an inferior copy. Plato says that. So in other words, when you go out there and you see beautiful trees and all, they're not real trees. They're just an inferior copy. Somewhere out in that Platonic realm, the realm of idea, is the real tree. It's there. It's fixed and immutable and doesn't change, and it's perfect. And to that way of thinking, it answers this question: what is nature? True nature, and this is why I said it's a startling deconstruction. True nature is metaphysical. In other words, real nature is up here. It's the metaphysic. It's beyond nature. And the earth and down here, it's all deception and an illusion. It's not reality. I mean, it's an astonishing thing to say, right? I mean, they come out with this and they reason it, and for well over 2,000 years, this stood. I mean, and you can see why in a way, because if we are, as the West became predominantly Christian culture, it dovetailed so nicely with that for all the reasons we've just said, because it imagined a physical and metaphysical realm as different and saw one as better and all that. But the problem is, from our point of view, from an environmental point of view, it sees what's down below here as inferior. So let's take another iClicker poll. So we kind of did a very quick run of Plato's philosophy. I mentioned I was tempted to have you read one of the dialogues, or like the central books of the Republic, but I thought the Abernathy was a quicker way to do it. And I was also hoping that when I explained it, which I've been doing, that it would be clear. But the question is, was it clear in your minds? Yeah, mostly I get some of it. Competing there. That's good enough, really. It's 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 an interesting approach, and I just wanted you to know that it's so important in the West. And I think if you get most of it, you got it here. And if you see how it connects up with Christian thinking, I'm not expecting you read, and by that I mean I won't ask you on exams to like flesh it out very separately, but just to know that in the West we've had this preoccupation with the physical and metaphysical, privileging one and not the other, not just because, as you might think, because of Christianity, given how pervasive it is, but because of this tradition as well. After Plato, and we're talking philosophy now, not theology or religion, the West has had this quest for constant presence, what is ever present temporally. So it's not just God in heaven, but again, justice, truth, beauty, these things that would be enduring. And almost every philosopher, all the major philosophers, agree with this and actually come with their own little take on it. So idea or ide is Plato in Greek, and then Aristotle also in Greek, substance or substantia. Descartes, in early modern theory, subjectivité in French, absolute spirit, which is Hegel in German, or Geist. Will zur Macht, again German, for Nietzsche is the will to power, and presence, going back to the Latin, presentia for Heidegger and Jacques Derrida. And I just mentioned it, you don't have to know all these, except know that the West has been obsessed with this, that there has to be something that is there in this upper part, that is always there, never changing, constantly present. But phusis, in terms of this, that which is constantly present, is just the opposite in a way. Phusis is the play of absence and presence. So think of the stream that is absent when there's a drought. The stream is no longer present, but then when it's flowing again, streaming, it is present. It is constantly absence and presence. It's the temporal process of emergence and falling away. You are, I am that. We are present now, but 100 years ago, none of us were present. And 100 years from now, unless there's new changes in life extension, 100 years from now, none of us will be present. We are caught in the play of absence and presence, unless, of course, you believe in a metaphysical realm, and you may be 100 years from now a luminous being of light somewhere. Sometimes a stream streams, sometimes it fails to stream during a drought, and that. So it's this play of absence and presence. And I kind of sum this up here in a cute little way. What is present is the present, and what is which is a present that will soon be absent. So I'll parse this out, and my play on words, I'll restate it here again. What is present? That means here in this place, spatially, this room right now is the present, the now, temporality, the moment. And when we switch gears and get to Buddhist thinking, they all talk a lot about the present, being here, living in the moment. And what is that moment? What is that present? It's a gift. It's a present. It's a gift of the moment. And in Buddhism, the Buddha talked about this in great detail, because if you don't believe that there's something up here, then maybe you want to think about what's down here. So stop thinking about this realm, start thinking about here, start thinking about this very moment, and see it as a present, as a gift, that the present is a present. It is a gift of the moment. So I'll explain this a little more as we go along here. You can see artifacts working this way. Interestingly, and the West has had a preoccupation with these kinds of artifacts. So how did Gilgamesh, try to get immortality? Well, he wanted to build the city of Uruk, principally stone, although smaller buildings and roofs and all were wood, and he thought it would last forever. You see all sorts of temples and artifacts trying to do that. So what are the go-to examples? Well, the pyramids were probably the best effort anyone's ever made, in the sense that they're just solid rock, and they're made in a very stable pyramid shape. They're not going to fall over or anything, and yet they're decaying now. And given enough time, they will completely decay. The Sphinx, I give an example because it's so old and it's a stone sculpture of King Khafra, but that, if you've seen any pictures of it lately, is decaying. We like this idea. So if you look at like state buildings like the US Capitol, why are they built that way? Why are they made of marble or cement and made to look that way? Well, because it's saying these buildings endure, this state endures. This is not something that's going to, fall away. You can rest assured that this is going to be here. These buildings will be here hundreds of years from now, and so will the United States. Corporate centers are made that way too, I think, and I think that's one of the reasons that the World Trade Center, when it was attacked, it showed that whole myth that it will be here forever, that world banking centering in the US is going to dominate the world for centuries, and then suddenly it collapses. And I think that was meant to not so much destroy buildings, which it was, and to show that the US was vulnerable, but also to show that this myth of endurance, it doesn't have to be that way. Tombstones are that way too, right? So our bodies decay, but they're marked by stones that we put there that will last well beyond our bodies. So you want to remember the person, can't visit their body, but and even if their body's in the ground, it may not, be much of it there anymore, but tombstones could last for centuries. It's anything made by a culture that endures. So it's material culture in the sense of tools and things like that. We've had a real propensity for that because we like this idea of things enduring. But I give an example down here of Japan's Jingshu Shrine, which is it's a temple, not unlike a Greek temple, I guess, but it's actually a wood structure. It's made out of cedar. And because even if you build out of cedar, which is a wood, if you don't know it, it'll last quite a while, more than most. But even that will decay. So to draw attention to this fact, every 20 years, they completely dismantle the building and rebuild a new one out of new cedar. So this has actually been around since the 7th century. So is it the same temple? Depends on how you look at it. The idea of it is the same. It looks identical every time. You could go through the centuries if you were like in a time ship like Doctor Who or something, and every century you could keep going and it would look brand new. It would not be decaying, because as soon as it starts to significantly decay, it gets rebuilt. In that sense, it's an acknowledgement that things constantly change. The world of Phusis is change. If you want something to endure, you have to build around the fact that it changes. Most things, Hannah Arendt will draw attention to this, like food and clothing and all. They don't really endure very long. Maybe you have favorite pair of jeans from a few years ago, but clothing doesn't really last very long. Food lasts even less. And for many cultures, there's just no attempt to create these things that endure. Artifacts, skipping that. So art is actually, from our purposes, from an eco-critical and environmental humanities perspective, interesting, because a culture endures through its art, maybe more than its artifacts. And I'd make the argument with the example of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh thought he was going to get immortality by cutting down the cedar forest and building up his city so that it would last for a long, long time. In fact, it didn't, and it got so covered over by the centuries that we had to rediscover it in the 19th century. But the Epic of Gilgamesh gave Gilgamesh immortality. It wasn't the city. I mean, he should have saved himself a lot of trouble and just found himself a few really good bards, a few good poets to write his story down, and made sure that those stone tablets that it was cut in were around, because it lasts for a long time. It holds an image across time. That's what we call art representational. It represents that image. There's lots of examples of it, but Shakespeare is consciously aware of this in sonnet number 18. You may know this, one of the most famous sonnets. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's how it opens, and then it ends with the couplet. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So you may know, Shakespeare was preoccupied, some might say obsessed, with a young man who he called beautiful. And he draws attention to the fact that this young man is incredibly beautiful. And then he says throughout the poem, which I didn't put the whole thing here, your beauty's not going to last. I want to tell you right now, you're going to grow old and you're going to be, well, you're not going to be what you were now. And he then says, and ending with the couplet, which always sort of plays with the meaning at the end of a Shakespearean sonnet anyhow, but don't worry, because I, Shakespeare, the artist, am going to take care of that. As long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. So as long as men are alive and can see, so long this, and this means the sonnet. So long as this sonnet lives, this sonnet gives life to thee. So we can know all about the beautiful young man because Shakespeare wrote about him. And 400 years later, after the young man is long, dead and buried, and long after he went from being a beautiful young man to an older man, maybe not as beautiful, or not as beautiful in the same way, Shakespeare immortalized him. This is what art can do. It can immortalize things. It does what Gilgamesh wanted, which is get immortality. Shakespeare gave the gift of immortality to the young man, at least the image of him. Art often does that. It tries to create a snapshot in whatever the medium is. And this is the medium of words, but it can be, in sculpture or something. But another kind of art, which we don't actually think that much about, and the West hasn't, and I think the argument would be made, why don't we think more about it? Because the West hasn't really focused much on it. That would be something like Andy Goldsworthy's art, in that, it draws attention to the fact that it's not going to endure. Shakespeare is kind of doing that too, that the young man's beauty won't endure, but the poem, which is made to live on, the beauty will live on in that. Goldsworthy, no such thing happens. I mean, if you remember the icicle sculpture he has, when that icicle melts, it's done, it's over. It's meant to draw attention to the fact that in the world in which we live, things are constantly in change, and it gestures away from itself, because what Goldsworthy doesn't want you to really think about the icicle as much as he wants you to think about, this is what life is. Life is this constant change, this endless, if you believe that, all that there is down here, and again, when we get to Buddhism, you're going to see that's all there is. There's just here, there's just this moment. And he wants to draw your attention to the fact that everything is changing, and the solution to it, and I'm not going to riff too much on Buddhism, but the Buddhist solution to it is there's only one thing to do. Be here now, in this moment. Be here for this moment. When you see that perfect rose or Shakespeare's perfect person, be there to witness it and experience it for what it is now. Be here in that moment, because that moment will always be passing away, and the only way to preserve it is to be here for it, because unless you do something like one of these efforts here to turn it into a huge monument like the Great Pyramid, or write a poem about it, it's going to go away and change. Language. Plato, and I haven't talked too much about it, but Plato focuses a lot on language. His word for it is logos. It's still alive and well today conceptually, in that logos became our word logical. It's there. This is where culture exists over time. So some languages will change and even die, but they endure far longer, with an N there, than human life. So even dead languages live on today. So Plato's language, Greek in the sense of ancient Greek, I mean, I know there's modern Greek, but Plato's language is dead now and it's different. Infused words with meaning, it hangs around. So even our word idea, such an important word, we've been focusing on it, that's coming right out of Greek. It's ide, or idios. So language is what endures beyond human beings' individual lifetime. So if you think about it, how do you endure? You know, human beings can't. We're just here for 100 years or so. You can create big monuments like the pyramids to try to endure. You can create artwork to try to endure, but language has a way of spanning across generations. And it's something wonderful that human beings have, and it allows us to work collectively, because I can not only communicate to you, but if I write this down, I can communicate it to people for hundreds of years if it's still around. And it does raise this question: is without language, how does a culture endure? Well, most human cultures, nearly all, have as a cornerstone of the thing that collects the people together is language. But there is material culture. You have tools and artifacts and all, but it's a shared language more than anything else that binds the people together in the present and across generations. So that's what unites us. If we all spoke different languages, this would be a very difficult lecture to give. It's what binds us together, the fact that we all at least know this particular language. You may know others too. And it is, of course, living on in literature, where it gets reproduced and constantly reinvented. Yeah. So Heidegger's argument. Modern technology is a quest for constant presence. So Heidegger's Dam, for example. Why? Because the stream's constantly streaming. It's a play of absence and presence. It's gone when there's a drought. It's overflowing its banks when there's a flood. The dam stops that and makes it constantly present. And why do we love fossil fuels so much? Because once you extract them, they're constantly present. And we've created all these immense technologies to make them constantly present. So in other words, wouldn't it be nice if you could have it light whenever you wanted it? Well, historically, how can you do that? I mean, you can light a fire, and up until not much longer than 100 years ago, the world was entirely lit by fire. That's the only way that people could bring about light. But now we can do that, a flick of a switch. I mean, it's incredibly complicated. We have to have power plants that are generally, most of them in California would be powered by so-called natural gas, which is methane, or coal, or we have other technologies. Similarly, if you're frustrated with temperature, if you're not willing, if you live in Santa Barbara, to be between 60 and 80 degrees all the time, and you want to be somewhere in the middle, well, we have technologies to do that, whether it's, heat supplied by electricity or gas, or people have had homes that were heated by coal. That was pretty common 100 years ago. Oil burners in houses. And of course, before that is wood. But wood never had the incredible power of fossil fuels, because it also allows you to do things like power vehicles and things like that. It's incredibly powerful in the sense that, well, you can see this because as new generation of electric cars come out, some of the bigger ones like the Ford F-150 pickup, the battery pack on that weighs almost a ton. It weighs 1,800 pounds. That's how much it takes to have that amount of energy. On the other hand, you can have a 10-gallon gas tank in that vehicle that would be like, under 100 pounds. So it's an incredible amount of energy in fossil fuels. That's why we love them. Heraclitus, a streaming stream, is a play of absence and presence. A good example, which we haven't talked about, is the slow food movement. So if you know about slow food, maybe you do in California, it kind of originated here and in Italy. So what is this? Well, if in modern technology and if our propensity is to have things always available, you can see how this would have created our modern food system. What do I mean by that? If you want a banana, you can get yourself a banana 24/7 any day of the year. You can go to a store and you can buy a banana. You can buy pretty much anything you want. You can buy an apple, you can buy most vegetables and all. You can buy asparagus. But how does that work? Well, with the banana, they don't grow for the most part in the continental United States, so they have to be brought pretty far. If it's something out of season, so let's use asparagus as an example. Well, California actually grows asparagus, some of the best asparagus, but we don't have, a constant season here. So sometimes when it's a little bit out of season, we have to go kind of far for us, which is Mexico, where they also grow a lot of asparagus, in which case it's close enough that it can get trucked here. But there are other times where when you just have to have asparagus and it's out of season, not to worry, you can still go to most, big supermarkets or Whole Foods or something and get asparagus. Why? Because it's brought in from the Southern Hemisphere. Then places in, say, for example, South America where it's grown, and it is literally flown in to be here. Why? Because we want to have it constantly present. And here's a little I don't know, a little tidbit regarding this. If you eat a largely plant-based diet and think that that's the best thing to do for the environment, it generally is, but not always. Because if you actually eat that asparagus that's been flown in from South America, its carbon footprint is probably about the same as chicken. And chicken has a much higher carbon footprint than most vegetables, but it can't compete with the fact that asparagus has to be flown in, which is exceptionally, problem climate-wise. Flying is like the worst thing you can do environmentally. So why do we do that though? I mean, why would you do something that's that detrimental to the climate? Well, Heidegger argues we just love this idea of having something like constantly present, and we've built our food system around it. So you can never be without that asparagus or banana. The slow food movement, which emerges a few decades ago, takes the opposite position, saying, well, that's pretty screwed up, right? Maybe what we should do is just eat food that's seasonal and that's grown locally. First off, this is going to be far better environmentally. You may know this fact but the average fruit or vegetable before it gets to your table travels 1,500 miles. Even if you live in California, even if you live like in Idaho, Idaho is known for potatoes. It grows more potatoes than anywhere and all. Most potatoes that people eat in Idaho weren't grown in Idaho. Why? Because they're coming in at different seasons and we're trucking things around all the time. Slow food movement says, nah, none of that. You should only eat things when they're in season and when they're in season locally for you. And environmentally, that would be so much better for the planet. And that's the way people normally ate. We forgot somehow that we ate. So this has to be, the slow food movement has to come as this innovation. But it was not an innovation. I mean, virtually all humanity for as long as we've been humans have only eaten food when it was seasonal and local. That's how we ate things. And the argument would be made by Heidegger and others, and especially proponents of the slow food, well then, you will like it more because of that present as a present thing. And what I mean by that is, if you're waiting, like right now when apples just came in season in this area, well, if you really like apples like I do, you're waiting and waiting and waiting for them to come in because that was like a present, right? It's like a gift that it comes in. It's only going to be here for a while. You can eat them as long as you can. You can store apples for a little while, like they have a root cellar or something, but not too long. But that's okay because then you wait for the next thing to come in, like stone fruit, like peaches and plums and all. And if you're in the cycles of nature, that's how you live. And the slow food movement is saying that's how we should do things. But it's just provocative to think that that's so antithetical to modern, food systems and modern Western agribusiness, because it just isn't. Arendt argues that this has always been the case with human beings. So let me shift here. Let's take another iClicker poll. I can't believe I'm really zipping through this material today. We haven't really talked about the documentaries, although I am delighted to read your comments on the documentaries. And the documentaries are a big part of this class, even though they're not in the lectures per se, so that we aren't dealing at this point, because we're still back over 2,000 years ago, we're not dealing with the climate crisis right now. So that in order to do that, we're dealing with, it's amazing, whenever I take the second roll, people just start walking out of the room, stand up and leaving. But okay, so have you been enjoying them? Yes and yes. Have enjoyed most of them. So that B, I think, is a fair answer. And enjoyed is a loaded word here. So if you haven't seen Fire in Paradise, I don't know whether that's a documentary that one enjoys. I mean, it is harsh and frightening, especially since it hits close to home here and all. But I'm glad that you're benefiting by them. So yeah. And again, keep up with the comments. They're really quite wonderful. It's argued by Hannah Arendt that stored grain is already a constant presence. So in other words, I just said that we like the idea you can have a banana, or you can have asparagus any time of the year, anywhere. But stored grains kind of did that. So in these ancient cultures, maybe you couldn't have asparagus whenever you want it, but you could have bread. And that's why bread gets the very good PR, the staff of life. It's the thing that you always have, and cultures have put so much of focus on it. We still do that today, by the way. And California grows an enormous amount of fruits and vegetables. I'll tell you how much in a minute. But it's interesting, like the Midwest in the United States is still caught up with growing things like grain and legumes. What do I mean by that? Wheat for bread, legumes like soybeans, things like that. And it's so much, we're so successful at growing these sort of stored grains and legumes that a single farmer in the Midwest in the United States grows enough food for 140 or 150 people. But fruit and vegetables are more difficult. They require more people to work at it. And California, you may be interested to know, you don't have to know these figures for the exam or anything, but 3/4 of all fruit consumed in the United States is grown in California. And 1/3 of all vegetables consumed in the US is grown in California. So we can do that because we have this warm climate. So something like fruit, we have like I can tell you this, I have strawberries growing in my house. You have 3 different seasons for growing strawberries in California. So places like where I'm from, back east, you have like 1 season and all, but we can continue growing food all throughout the year, which is why we can send it all over the US. Hannah Arendt argues that all truly human cultures have always sought constant presence. I think that's a very contested and, again, worrisome comment, but it's consistent with Western thinking. So if it's a dark side of Western thinking, then that's probably what it is. There's no need, by the way, in the prelapsarian, before the fall or the golden age or the golden race and all, no need of agriculture, because the way it's imagined is a beneficent Mother Earth provides for us and all. So there's no need for it. Arendt argues that cultures, not true to human cultures, and don't see constant presence. And pre-industrial cultures and many cultures have not been caught up in that. And again, Arendt nastily sees that as a problem, but she's coming at it from a very Western perspective. If you think about it from an environmental perspective, those cultures are actually far more benign environmentally. And what I mean by that is, well, if you're not flying, asparagus all over the planet, and if you're not trucking, potatoes 1,500 miles, it's a lot better off. If you're not trying to optimize yield and all by using, petrochemical fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, and all that, it's far better. And so in that sense, you allow yourself to get caught up in the cycles of nature, and you're content with that. Yeah, so that's ancient technology. And there you go. For the first time ever, we finished early. I keep finishing late, but there you go. So see you next time for lecture number 6. People are clapping because I finished early, so I'll always try.